So when it came down to it, I debated for a really long time if I wanted to include this section or not because I didn't want to confuse you guys. In the end, though, I decided to because estimation questions are very difficult to just figure out the answer for off the top of your head. But once you know the format and the framework, they're super, super easy. Most of the time, I never even got asked a single estimation question when going through the recruiting process. The only time that I know of people getting asked are during the Google strategy interview. And still, that's not a guaranteed question. For those of you who don't know, estimation questions, otherwise known as market sizing questions, are questions that basically are an example is how much an ad revenue does Bing do every year? Or how many bricks would it take to make the Empire State Building? Or how many windows does the Empire State Building have? They're very large, abstract questions where basically the answer is incredibly hard to come up with. Like, how do you calculate the number of windows on the Empire State Building? It's really difficult, but if you know the basic framework on how to get to the answer, they're a breeze to do. So that's what we're going to show you here today, is how to answer those estimation questions. The first thing you need to know about estimation questions is no one really cares about your answer that much. They're more interested in your thought process and the structure you take to get to your answer, and that's what matters more. That's why throughout these process, sanity checks, as I referred to as the other video, is great. Just check in with your interviewer to make sure you're on the right pace. We're going to follow a top-down approach for most of our estimation questions. So that means taking a large funnel and working towards our way to the bottom. These are the steps that you're going to be taking when going through estimation questions. First, you want to clarify the question. You want to make sure you understand everything about it. So if someone asks about phones, you want to verify, do you include tablets as phone? What defines a phone? Second, you want to break down the problem and catalog all the information that you know of. For example, if someone was to ask you, what's the smartphone market? Okay, does that market include just the US, or are we doing the entire world? What defines that smartphone? Well, I know that there's 7 billion people in the world, so I'm going to write down that number. That's the section where you want to make sure you understand every part of the question and you're cataloging the information that you know of. Third, you want to come up with an equation to solve the problem. If we're looking at the world smartphone market, well, we need to define how we're going to get to that number, and that's going to be our equation. We have to first, in the previous question, define what do we mean by market. We're going to assume that means market size, so the annual amount in phone sales. For the equation, we would just simply take the amount of phone sales, the amount of phones sold multiplied by the average price equals the market. That would be our equation, and we would be working on filling in the pieces of this. As I said in the previous section, the next step after you come up with your question is actually to work towards filling each of those sections. When you take these problems and break it into smaller problems, it's easier to fill in those bits to really come in and connect the dots. After we've filled in our equation, we want to go back and just make sure we're not missing any edge cases. And by edge cases, things we didn't think of. If we're doing smartphone markets, does the interviewer want us to include resale? This isn't something that you should definitely consider in the beginning as well, but always make sure at the end, once you have your equation and once you've filled it in, that you're checking for edge cases and you really haven't missed anything else. After you've filled in your equation and you've run your edge cases and you have your number, do a sanity check. Just ask your interviewer, does this seem reasonable to you? And usually they'll give you some feedback. They'll be like, oh, it seems a bit small. Maybe you're not including everything. Oh, that seems pretty big. Maybe you didn't eliminate some factors. And they'll kind of guide you towards helping you find a closer estimate, or they'll tell you that I think that sounds pretty accurate. Now, let's go through an example together. The way I'm going to approach this equation for figuring out how many smartphones are sold in the entire world, I'm going to look at two parts. The first part, I'm going to look at the number of smartphones that are sold to first-time users, and then the number of smartphones that are replacing current users. First, I know that there is about 7 billion people in the world, so that's going to be our starting number. And then for simplicity's sake, I'm going to assume that the age expectancy of a person is 70 years old and that people are evenly distributed across age. So there's going to be 100 million people per age. if we assume that the first time smartphone user is going to buy their phone at age 16, which I would agree is accurate for the United States, but I don't know if that's accurate for the rest of the world. Therefore, again, just for this problem, I'm going to assume that is right for the United States. That would mean that there are going to be 100 million 16-year-olds in the world who are getting their first smartphone. Well, we know that's 100 million, but we don't know that all of them are going to get a smartphone. Therefore, let's just say about 50% of them are going to get a smartphone. This is going to be more heavily weighted, I think, towards the United States, Europe, China, and other parts of the developing world. And in underdeveloped countries, I think that's going to leave a lot of people out. Therefore, let's just say 50% of these 100 million people are going to be getting their first smartphone. This leaves us with 50 million people in the entire world who are going to be buying their first smartphone at about the age of 16 this year. I'd also like to add that the age doesn't necessarily matter because we're assuming there's an evenly distributed amount of people over every age. So if we adjust the age to 17 or 18, it should still be about the same. Therefore, age doesn't necessarily play a huge part in this number. However, we still have 50 million people who are going to be buying their first smartphone this year. For the next part of the question, we're going to be looking at the number of people who are going to be replacing their smartphones this year. Going off the assumptions above, we know that about 50% of the entire world has a smartphone. This would mean that 3.5 billion people in the entire world right now have a smartphone. Now that we have 3.5 billion in the world currently have a smartphone, let's assume that 4% of the people in the world renew their phone every year. Obviously, this is going to be longer for some than others. I usually get a new phone every 3, but a friend of mine hasn't got a new phone in 6 years. Therefore, let's just assume 4 is a number for most people in the entire world that aren't necessarily privileged to buy one every 2 years, a new phone. This would mean that 875 million people are going to be replacing their phones this year. If we add that with the 50 million before, that's going to leave us with 925 100 million people that are going to be buying cell phones this year. Now that we have the number of people, 925 million, we need to calculate the price of smartphones. Well, an iPhone sells for about $1,200, but you can get cheap phones as cheap as $100, which I think a lot of people do. And I think we might be putting too much weight on the United States if we assume that everyone in the world spends as much money as the United States does. Therefore, let's assume that people are going to spend about $500 per smartphone. Now, to conclude our equation, we're going to multiply the number of smartphones by the price. So 925 million smartphones multiplied by $500 at each smartphone. This is going to leave us with a total market of $462.5 billion smartphone market. Would you, as the interviewer, think this is a reasonable number? Now, taking a step back from that question, you saw what I did. I basically take this really big abstract problem and you keep funneling it down. And it's okay to make those assumptions how I just kind of said, like, oh, we're going to sell it for $500. Well, let's assume that, 50% of those people get a phone. As long as you say numbers and state everything and then back it up in a way, you're going to be okay for estimation questions. And if you look it up, the total smartphone market is about $500 to $600 billion. So I really didn't miss it by that much of a mark. It's interesting to see if, as long as you think through these market sizing problems, you can come up with a number that's pretty close. It's just when you miss those key elements where you get really off track. Now, it's really easy to get lost with these problems, so I highly, highly, highly recommend writing down all of your assumptions, all of your numbers, your equation, and writing this down. I was able to pause, look at my notes while filming this video. And in addition, what I've done is, one, I've included a fact sheet that has basically all the quick numbers you should know: population of the US, population of the world, numbers that you could know to reference during your interview. These are all numbers you should be familiar with. The next thing I've included is also resources to link to other videos if you're curious. I'm not the best at explaining market sizing videos, but there's tons of resources out there, and I just wanted to be able to connect you with ones. It's a very consulting type question that comes up in almost every consulting interview. So there's a lot of videos like that explain it incredibly well and way better than I ever could.